Hi everyone, my name is Sophia Christophi and I'm an autistic adult. And today I'm going to be talking about my experiences of autism. So I have a background in psychology, and although I have my own definition of autism, I thought it might be interesting to see what one of my psychology textbooks thinks autism is. And I came across this definition. So from a textbook, autism is the informal term for autistic spectrum disorder, a cluster of mental dysfunctions that is characterized by extreme self-absorption and lack of empathy, repetitive motor activities, and the impairment of language and conceptual skills. Personally, I think this is a terrible definition, and I was quite surprised to see this in a fairly modern textbook. So I'm going to get rid of that one and give you my definition of autism. So to me, autism is simply a neurological difference, and it means that autistic people perceive, process, and understand the world in ways that are different to non-autistic people. Although autistic people share similar characteristics, no two autistic people are the same. Many of you have probably heard the term the autism spectrum, and typically people think the autism spectrum looks a bit like this. So they imagine a line, and on one end, they think there are low functioning autistic people, and on the other end, high functioning autistic people. But the spectrum isn't actually linear. The spectrum is a bit more like this. So each color on this will represent a different area related to autism. So green might be sensory, orange anxiety, red language, and so on. So if we take the green section, you may have person A who is hypersensitive to sensory stimuli. So they may find noises too loud or lights too bright. And person B might be a sensory seeker. They may look for that additional sensory information. But that doesn't mean that person A is any more or less autistic than person B. Every autistic person is different. And this can also help explain why some autistic people can often present with an uneven set of skills, which is sometimes referred to as the spiky profile. And that means that we may really excel in some areas and really struggle in others. And it's why labels like high and low functioning are not particularly helpful. So people will often assume that I'm high functioning because I've done my PhD, I drive a car, all of these reasons that people give for assuming that I'm high functioning. But despite the fact that I'm 28 years old, I still struggle to be without my parents. I still won't attend medical appointments on my own. And there are lots of things that I still struggle to do. So I didn't find out that I'm autistic until I was 16. And for me, the process went as followed. I'd seen the GP in July of 2011, and I was referred to CAMHS. And I've been seen by CAMHS in October of that same year, which I appreciate is unheard of now. And they referred me to an autism specialist. And then I had my diagnostic assessment in June 2012. I often get asked what triggered this chain of events. And for me, it was year 10 work experience day. So up until that point, I had been managing fairly well at school. I was doing okay academically. I was very quiet. I just liked to try and blend into the background. I was a very anxious student. Not that anybody would have necessarily noticed that. Getting into school in the morning was really tricky, but I found that once I got into school, I would often mask my difficulties. So I will talk about masking a little bit later on, but masking is something that's quite common in autistic girls and is definitely something that I recognize I do myself and have done for a long time. Although back when I was at school, the term masking wasn't commonly used as it is today. As I started to go through the school years and we approached year 10, we started to have to think about doing work experience. And this involved a work experience day, which involved going to a new place and taking part in mock interviews, writing CVs, and all of these things in preparation for our upcoming work experience. And a teacher happened to ask me if I was looking forward to it, and where I would normally say yes or just nod and say that I'm fine, I just broke down. I wasn't able to hold it all together anymore. And I ended up telling her that I was very anxious about it all and I didn't think I could do it. And this resulted in me having a conversation with the deputy head teacher at my school. And we talked about my school experience and some of the things that I'd felt and things that I'd struggled with. And he had mentioned that lots of the things that I was describing is very similar to some other students that he's worked with, and that they were autistic. At this point, I didn't know anything about autism. I didn't know what it meant to be autistic, but we ended up having a meeting with my mum, and we were sent away to read up about autism and see what we thought. And that's exactly what we did. And suddenly lots of things started to make sense. So why did it take so long for me to get an autism diagnosis? I think it's a combination of reasons, and some of them are the following. So awareness of autism in the 90s when I was young wasn't as good as it is today. As a child, I met all my developmental milestones either on time or early, so no concerns were raised there. In terms of my academic performance, I really loved reading and computers, and I enjoyed studying and learning. So again, there was no concerns in terms of me managing my work. This masking and coping, looking back, I was very aware from quite early on that I felt different to other people. It seemed that everybody else just intuitively knew what to do and how to respond and how to behave. And I didn't feel that I had that. So I would spend a lot of time watching other people to see how I should behave or how I should perform in certain situations. And lastly is personality traits. So growing up, I was always labeled as being shy, sensible, introverted, and these typically explained away all of my anxieties or my difficulties in making friends with people my own age. And actually, it was undiagnosed autism all along. So now I thought we could talk a bit about the key characteristics of autism in more detail, and specifically how these look different in autistic girls, given that autistic girls are much more likely to be diagnosed later on. So some of the key characteristics of autism are differences in social communication, differences in social interaction, sensory differences, stimming, restrictive behaviors and routines, special or highly focused interests, anxiety, and meltdowns, shutdowns, and burnout. So in terms of social communication, this refers to both verbal and non-verbal communication, so things like gesture and tone of voice. And autistic people vary in terms of their social communication. So some autistic people may have limited speech. Others may appear to have good language skills, but can struggle with understanding sarcasm, or they may take things literally. So for me as a child, I developed language very early on, and I was said to have quite a large vocabulary, but I did struggle with the nuances of language, and I did take things extremely literally. And there are other autistic people who communicate using echolalia, so they may repeat back what people have said to them. Typically in autistic girls, we tend to be better at mimicking the verbal and non-verbal communication skills of others. Language and communication difficulties might be more subtle. And we tend to be better at masking or camouflaging our difficulties. In terms of social interaction, it can be difficult for autistic people to read other people, but it's also difficult for non-autistic people to read autistic people. So traditionally, whenever there's been a miscommunication or a misunderstanding during a social interaction, often it's thought that it's the autistic person's fault because they haven't picked up on the appropriate social cue, or they've just not understood the situation. But there was a really interesting study that was done that asked people to communicate a message between each other. And in one group, autistic people had to communicate a message to other autistic people. In another group, non-autistic people communicated a message to non-autistic people. And in a third group, it was the crossover, so autistic to non-autistic communication. And what they found was when autistic people had to communicate with other autistic people, communication went well, there was no difficulties, and the exchange was fine. And likewise for non-autistic people communicating with other non-autistic people. The difficulty comes about when two different brains are trying to communicate. And I think that's really important because it doesn't mean that one person is correct or incorrect in their communication style. It just means that there's two different communication styles happening, and sometimes that can lead to misunderstandings that are not necessarily either person's fault. Autistic people can find it difficult to form and maintain friendships, particularly with non-autistic people. Conversations may be limited to topics of interest, and some just prefer their own company. In autistic girls, some autistic girls are much more socially driven. They may be nurtured by a group of other girls or have one very close friend. Some autistic girls are described as being shy, anxious, or quiet, whereas others are seen as chatty and sociable. And traits of autism may become apparent later on with girls, particularly as social demands increase. So as a child, for me, I was very happy with my own company. I didn't seek out social relationships. I quite enjoyed being on my own, reading my books or being on a computer. And I never had a particular interest in playing with other children. And that may have caused some people to think there may be something going on. But I think the reason why it still wasn't picked up at an early age was because I went to school with a cousin who is the same age as me, and we were in the same class. And my cousin is very sociable and had lots of friends, and she would often let me tag along with her group of friends. So to the outside world, it looked like I had a big group of friends as well, but actually I was always on the periphery, and I struggled to engage with people my own age and find things to talk about. Sensory differences. So many autistic people process sensory information differently, and this could be in relation to sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, a vestibular sense, which is our sense of balance, and proprioception, so our awareness of body in space. There's also another sense, interoception, and that's your ability to recognize internal cues. So things like regulating body temperature, or recognizing feelings of hunger or thirst. So for me, I often find it hard to differentiate between feeling hungry or anxious because I perceive the two feelings to be the same. And sometimes it means that I have to go through a process of elimination. So if I have this sensation and I have something to eat and that feeling goes away, then I can conclude that I was probably hungry. If I do that and I still have this sensation, then I start to think maybe I'm anxious, and then I need to explore what I could possibly be anxious about. So as I said in the beginning, some individuals are hypersensitive to sensory information. Noises might be too loud, smells too strong, and flavors overpowering. And other autistic people are hyposensitive. So they may seek sensory input through rocking, chewing things, enjoying really spicy foods. They may struggle to know an appropriate distance to stand from another person. But I think the important thing about sensory differences in autistic people is that you can be both hypersensitive and hyposensitive to sensory information. So in some cases, I'm definitely hypersensitive. I struggle with loud noises, and particularly in school, that was a challenge with the corridors, also the smells of like the canteen, and just the general visual overcrowdedness that happens in school. On the other hand, in terms of taste, I very much enjoy spicy foods or strong flavors. So in that sense, I would be a sensory seeker. Stimming. Stimming is self-stimulatory behavior, and it's the repetitive and rhythmic movements, sounds, or use of objects. The most common examples of stimming are things like flapping, rocking, or spinning objects. And it's a type of self-regulation if somebody is overstimulated. It can be an anxiety management tool. It may be a way of gaining extra sensory input, or a way of expressing or reacting to an emotion. So if I was delivering this talk in person right now, you would probably all be quite dizzy because my stim is to sway from side to side. The reason for that is because it helps me concentrate, and it helps me manage sort of high levels of anxiety associated with presenting. So I would be swaying from side to side as a way of managing my emotions. But I would just like to point out here that everybody stims. So one of my favorite things to do when I'm out, and next time you're out, if you have a look around, if you're in a coffee shop or wherever you may be, you will probably notice somebody jiggling their leg, or picking at a coffee cup, clicking a pen. These are all types of stims. I think the main difference between autistic and non-autistic people is that our stims just tend to be a bit more obvious. But many people engage in stimming behaviors, and it's not something that needs to be discouraged unless it's causing harm or is dangerous in any way, in which case some strategies might need to be put in place to encourage safer stimming habits. Restricted behaviors and routines. Alongside stimming, lots of autistic people display restricted behaviors and a need for routine, and it can present in lots of ways. One of those is lining up toys or objects, being particular about how personal belongings are arranged, getting very upset by changes in routine, insisting on eating the same foods or wearing the same clothes, or having strong interest or focusing on parts of an object. For me, I don't really like the term restricted behaviors and routines. I think it implies that autistic people are sort of being inflexible, or that we're rigid. But I actually think that these types of behaviors serve a very important purpose. So as an autistic person, I'm constantly noticing things that are changing in my environment, even the smallest of details. And this makes me feel very anxious because it means to me that the environment is unpredictable. So when I was at school, I was probably one of the few students who really enjoyed wearing school uniform because it was the same every day. And when I got to sixth form and I had to wear my own clothes, I found that really challenging. So one of the things that I did was every Monday I wore the same clothes, every Tuesday I wore the same clothes, and I made my own uniform for the school week. I also ate the same lunch every day for the whole time that I was at school. I had to sit in a particular seat in the classroom. I had to take a particular route to school. And although these things may seem really rigid and may seem that I was kind of inflexible to change, they actually helped me manage all the other changes that go on during the day. So for me, knowing that taking the same route to school, getting there, sitting in the same seat, having a familiar pair of clothes on, eating the same lunch that day, I knew that they were consistent things that I could rely on, and that helped reduce anxiety, particularly when you're so sensitive to noticing change in your environment. So I do think that these sorts of behaviours serve a purpose, and they're very important to me in being able to manage very high levels of anxiety. Special or highly focused interests. So lots of autistic people have special interests, or I prefer the term highly focused interests. And they are important because they can be a source of pleasure, they can reduce anxiety, they can be a conversation starter or boost social opportunities, particularly if you can meet other people who share your interest. And they can lead to specialized skills. I find the term special interests a bit unpleasant. I think when a non-autistic person knows lots and lots and lots about something, they tend to be viewed as an expert. But when you're autistic, it's kind of just made part of your autism, and it's sort of not viewed as in the same way. So that's why I prefer highly focused interests. And my interests, I've had lots of them over the years. And I tend to, when I become interested in something, I need to find out everything there is to know about it, which is probably why once I found my interest in psychology, I went and completed a PhD because I needed to know everything there was to know about my particular area. So as I said, remember that non-autistic people who have extensive knowledge in a particular area are usually called experts. And sometimes as an autistic adult, it can feel a bit sort of pathologizing to think that any of my highly focused interests are just because I'm autistic. In autistic girls, highly focused interests can be less obvious to spot. So typically autistic girls lean towards things like books, dolls, people watching to learn social rules. Some autistic girls may be interested in fashion or makeup, and it may not seem that they are any different to their non-autistic peers. So although the interest may not seem unusual when compared to other girls their age, I think the key thing to look out for in autistic girls is the intensity of the interests. So as a child, I really enjoyed reading. I loved words. I loved books. And many children my age also went through a stage of enjoying books and reading too. But I think the difference for me was the intensity of that interest. So I would read 3 or 4 books a day. I loved doing word searches. It was an all-consuming interest. So although it wasn't an unusual interest as such, the intensity of the interest is what kind of gave it away. Autism and anxiety. Lots of autistic people experience very high levels of anxiety, and it can be for a number of reasons. Things like changes in routine can be really hard to manage, sensory differences, navigating social interactions, and understanding emotions. So how can you help an autistic person manage their anxiety? The first thing would be to keep changes to a minimum where possible. Of course, unexpected things do happen, but if you are aware of a young person who is about to go through a big change, that might be going on holiday, moving house, or school transitions, then trying to prepare that person as much as possible would be very helpful. When it came to me leaving school, I was extremely anxious about going to university because school for me, although was challenging from a sensory perspective and from a social perspective, it was familiar. It was the place that I'd known for all my teenage years, and I couldn't imagine being somewhere new and having to start all over again. So one of the things that really helped me was to have a very carefully planned transition to university, and that involved visiting the campus, meeting new members of staff, having a look around long before I was due to go. The other thing that I found very helpful was to take photos of my school, of my teachers. Some of my teachers wrote me letters, and I compiled these all into a folder so that when I eventually did make that transition, when I was feeling anxious or felt like I needed that familiarity, I could look to this folder, and it gave me a sort of sense of comfort. So using visual supports and timetables can be really helpful. And keeping an anxiety diary to identify any triggers as well. And lastly, to consider whether the environment is sensory friendly. So as an adult, I still underestimate how much the sensory aspect of the environment contributes to my anxiety levels. So if I'm in an office and that it's really bright or it's really busy, I can start to feel very anxious and not realize it's because there's too much sensory information. This was particularly challenging at school. Schools can be very busy places. So some of the things that I found helpful were to be able to leave my lesson a few minutes earlier to get to the next class, meant that I didn't have to deal with that sensory overload in the corridors. Being able to be sat by a door, that's always been my preferred seating position. And it meant that I was able to leave for a few moments if I needed to and come back in without disrupting anyone or without feeling that people were watching me. Other things that helped at school were having a safe person that I could talk to if things were becoming difficult, but also having a backup person, because sometimes that teacher or the Senko may not have been there, and that may have meant that I wasn't able to communicate with anyone else. But having a key person and another person who is aware and kept up to date with how things are going meant that over time I felt much more able to go and express what I was struggling with. So yeah, anxiety can be a really difficult thing to manage for autistic people, and it's about trying to find ways to help that person manage that anxiety. Then we have meltdowns, shutdown, and burnout. So a meltdown can present with quite extreme behaviors, is typically thought of as an external reaction. The person may seem as if they're exploding. It may involve screaming, shouting, hitting, but it's not to be mistaken for a tantrum. When an autistic person has a meltdown, their brain has reached their capacity to be able to cope with whatever the situation is. A meltdown might be triggered by sensory overload, by a change in routine, by an accumulation of small triggers that have led to this meltdown. But it's not goal directed in any way. So the person is not doing it for attention or because they're trying to achieve something. They have just reached the point of no longer being able to cope. A shutdown can be thought of as the opposite of a meltdown. So instead of the sort of exploding reaction, an individual may implode. So they may withdraw or retreat. They may find it hard to talk or want to be left alone. I think as a child, I was maybe more prone to meltdowns. I'd get very upset and I'd cry, and I'd find it difficult to manage. Whereas as an adult now, I think I'm much more likely to shut down if things become difficult, and just find communicating difficult as well, not wanting to talk. Shutdowns can be particularly common in autistic girls. And it may also be the case that somebody shuts down following a meltdown. It may be that younger autistic girls are more prone to meltdowns and they shut down as they become older. Every autistic person will be different in this respect. And the last thing is burnout. So this is the result of chronic stress over a long period of time, and it can present as exhaustion, loss of skills, and increased sensory sensitivities. In this case, all demands need to be removed, and that person needs to be able to rest and slowly reintegrate into doing activities that they enjoy. So now to talk a little bit more about masking and camouflaging. As I said before, this is something that's quite common in autistic girls, but is something that autistic boys may do as well. And this is where somebody suppresses their natural autistic behaviors or responses. They may try to appear non-autistic or hide their autistic traits. One of the ways that autistic people mask is through scripting. So some autistic people develop scripts for social situations, and they may rehearse these conversations in advance. So I didn't realize for a long time that this wasn't what everybody does. I thought everybody had a script, but apparently they don't, and people can just have conversations and it flows backwards and forwards, and there's no need to consult their script. I can't imagine interacting like this, so I have a script for lots of different situations. For example, if I go to work after the weekend, I think in advance that somebody may ask me how my weekend was, and I will have a set of responses ready for that. The challenging thing as an autistic person who uses scripts is that other people don't know I have a script and they don't necessarily follow my script. So sometimes I have to try to navigate conversations that have gone off topic and that I feel unprepared for. Another type of masking is appearing sociable by behaving in a way that you think other people want you to behave. So it might be by holding in your stims or pretending to be interested in a topic. Watching and mimicking others, including facial expression and tone of voice, is another way of masking. So typically my face and my tone of voice is the same, regardless of whether I'm happy, sad, excited, any of those emotions. And if I were to mask, I would have to make a conscious effort to change my facial expression or change my tone of voice. It's not something that sort of comes naturally. Avoiding talking about interests or trying to act normal, whatever that means, or however you feel other people would perceive you as being normal. Suppressing reactions to sensory discomfort. So being in a situation where you're finding the noise overwhelming or the lights too much, but being unable to express that discomfort and just sitting there and tolerating it. Blending into the background, which is something I tried to do for a very long time, and I think is one of the reasons why I went unnoticed as an autistic person until I was older. And monitoring your own interactions. Again, this is another thing that I didn't realize that other people don't do. But for me, if I'm having a conversation with somebody, I'm constantly thinking, am I making enough eye contact? Should I smile now? Now would be a good time to blink. Now would be a good time to look away. Now I need to look back. There's a whole sort of internal monologue that goes on to get through sort of social interactions. So often when we think about autism and the experiences of autistic people, there's a lot of discussion around the struggles and the difficulties, and they shouldn't be ignored. But I do think that we need to balance it out with some of the positive aspects of being autistic. So Harriet Cannon from the University of Leeds created an infographic which looks at some of the positive features that might be related to autism. And these are things like having a great attention to detail, deep focus, observational skills, being able to absorb and retain facts, visual skills, expertise, having a methodical approach, having unique thought processes and coming up with innovative solutions, creativity, tenacity and resilience, accepting of difference and integrity. So thank you very much for letting me share my experience with you today. But I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you.